Life in medieval Scotland was not arranged around comfort, optimism, or the idea that tomorrow might be better. It was arranged around surviving today, preferably without getting too wet, too cold, or too hungry before sunset. Most people woke up early, not because they believed in productivity, but because daylight was limited and candles were expensive. Homes were small, low, and built to trap heat rather than joy. Stone walls leaked cold, slowly but constantly. Smoke from the hearth rarely found its way out cleanly, so mornings often began with coughing, blinking, and the quiet realization that the fire had gone out sometime during the night. Beds were not private spaces. They were shared, narrow, and filled with straw that had already lived several lives before being called bedding. Families slept together not for closeness, but because body heat was a resource. If you woke up sore, stiff, or smelling faintly of sheep, that was considered normal. Breakfast was not exciting. For most people, it was some version of oats. Porridge appeared in many forms and moods, depending on whether grain stores were full or nearly gone. Sometimes it was thick, sometimes watery, sometimes skipped entirely. Meat was rare, unless you were important, lucky, or willing to argue with a local lord about hunting rights. Most people were not. Clothing did its best, which was not very much. Wool scratched, linen wore thin, and shoes often leaked. Rain was constant enough to be treated as a background feature of existence rather than weather. Mud clung to everything. Roads were suggestions more than surfaces. Travel was slow, damp, and involved long pauses to rest or complain quietly. Work began early and ended when light failed. Farming dominated life, even for those who did not own land. Fields were worked by hand, season after season, with the understanding that weather could undo months of effort in a single afternoon. A poor harvest did not cause panic immediately. It caused a slow tightening of routines. Meals grew smaller, repairs were postponed, people spoke less about the future. Disease was common, poorly understood, and mostly endured rather than treated. A fever might pass, it might not. Injuries were dangerous because infection was not a concept yet, just an unfortunate pattern people noticed after wounds turned black and unpleasant. Healing relied on rest, herbs, prayer, and waiting. Water was drawn from nearby sources that were also used by animals, which explains many things. Cleanliness existed, but not in modern terms. Bathing happened occasionally, often for social or medical reasons, and sometimes involved sharing water with others who had arrived earlier. Social life revolved around necessity. Markets, churches, and seasonal gatherings were moments when people met, traded, and exchanged information slowly. News traveled by word of mouth, becoming less accurate with each retelling. Entertainment was simple: stories, music, and drinking, when possible. Silence was also common, and not considered awkward. Authority was visible and heavy. Lords controlled land, the church controlled time. Kings were distant ideas rather than daily concerns. Most people lived and died within a small radius, rarely seeing the wider world, except through stories that grew more impressive with repetition. Nightfall brought cold back into focus. Fires were fed carefully. Doors were barred. Darkness arrived fully, without streetlights or distraction. People slept because there was little else to do, and because morning would arrive whether they were ready or not. Life in medieval Scotland was not dramatic in the way stories often suggest. It was repetitive, restrained, and quietly exhausting. Survival was not heroic, it was routine, and for most people, that was enough. Over time, that routine settled into the body. People did not think of their lives as especially harsh because comparison was limited. Everyone around them lived much the same way, measured by seasons rather than years. Childhood ended early, not through ceremony, but through usefulness. By the time a child could carry water, scare birds from fields, or mind younger siblings, they were already part of the household economy. Food scarcity shaped behavior quietly. Nothing was wasted because nothing could be replaced easily. Bones were boiled until they gave up whatever flavor they had left. Bread hardened, then softened again in broth. Leftovers were not a category. They were simply tomorrow. Hunger was not constant for everyone, but the awareness of it was. It hovered in the background, influencing decisions without being spoken aloud. Homes remained crowded and dim. Windows were small to keep heat in, which meant light was always limited. During winter, much of life happened near the hearth. Tasks were performed slowly and close together. Tools were shared. Space was negotiated with glances rather than words. Privacy, as a concept, had not yet arrived. Noise was different then. There were no engines, no hum of electricity. Instead, sound came from animals, weather, and human effort. Wind through grass, rain on stone. The low murmur of conversation. Silence was frequent and unremarkable. It was not filled. It was accepted. Clothing was repaired endlessly. Patches layered over patches until the original fabric was mostly memory. Colors faded quickly. Bright clothing existed, but not for long, and not for many. Most wardrobes were practical and restrained, shaped by climate rather than taste. What you wore was what you had. Medical care, when needed, was local and uncertain. Healers relied on experience and tradition. Some treatments helped, others did nothing. A few made things worse. People learned which remedies were worth trying and which were best avoided, but outcomes remained unpredictable. Survival often depended less on treatment and more on endurance. Religious life structured time in a way that felt stable. Bells marked hours. Feast days offered brief changes in routine. Fasting days were endured. Faith provided explanation where understanding did not. When illness struck or crops failed, causes were framed in moral or spiritual terms, which at least gave events a shape. Conflict existed, but most people experienced it indirectly. Raids, feuds, and wars happened. But for many villagers, they arrived as rumors first, then taxes, then missing men. Daily life continued around these disruptions, adjusting without stopping. Travel was rare enough to be noteworthy. When someone left, it was discussed. When they returned, they were listened to. Stories from elsewhere carried weight, even if they were exaggerated. For most people, the world was small, and that smallness was manageable. Evenings ended early. Without artificial light, productivity declined naturally. People spoke less as the fire dimmed. Sleep arrived gradually, without preparation rituals. Exhaustion did most of the work. Dreams came and went, unnoticed unless they lingered. Death was familiar, but not dramatic. It happened at home, among people who had known the person all their lives. There was grief, but also practicality. Work continued. Fields still needed tending. Life adjusted around absence. Medieval Scotland did not feel like history to those living in it. It felt like normal. Cold was normal. Effort was normal. Uncertainty was normal. Life was not measured by comfort, but by continuation. And so days passed, similar enough to blur together, different enough to require attention. Not heroic, not tragic, just lived, quietly, until they ended. As years accumulated, age revealed itself less through numbers and more through capability. Backs stiffened, hands slowed. Strength faded gradually enough that it was noticed only when something could no longer be lifted or finished in a day. Old age was not marked by retirement. It was marked by doing the same work more slowly, with more pauses, and accepting help without comment. Weather remained the dominant presence. Summers were brief and unreliable. A good season could mean relative comfort. A bad one meant months of quiet adjustment. People learned to read signs in the sky, in the behavior of animals, in the feel of the air. None of it guaranteed anything. It only suggested how cautious one should be. Firewood was gathered constantly. Warmth required preparation. Forest access was regulated, so collecting fuel involved negotiation, permission, or quiet risk. Fires were maintained carefully, never wasted. Letting a fire die completely meant effort and time to start again, and both were valued. Children learned by watching. There was little formal instruction. Skills were passed down through repetition. Mistakes were corrected calmly or ignored, depending on severity. By adolescence, most knew enough to function. Education existed, but not widely. For many, knowledge meant knowing land boundaries, planting times, and which paths stayed passable after rain. Animals shared space closely. Chickens wandered. Livestock stayed near homes. Their presence meant food, labor, and constant noise. Smell was unavoidable and unremarkable. Animals were cared for because they mattered, not because they were liked. Law was uneven. Local disputes were settled by custom or authority figures, whose judgments were final, whether fair or not. Justice moved slowly and selectively. For most people, staying unnoticed was preferable to being right. The church offered structure beyond belief. It was where people gathered, learned news, and marked life events. Attendance was expected. Participation was habitual. Whether deeply felt or simply accepted, faith shaped explanations and softened uncertainty. Time passed without urgency. There were no clocks in most homes. Days were guided by light and tasks rather than schedules. Patience was not a virtue. It was a necessity. Occasionally, something broke the pattern. A harsh winter, a sickness that moved quickly, a visitor with unfamiliar ideas. These moments were remembered. They were discussed quietly and then absorbed into memory, becoming reference points rather than turning points. Joy existed, but it was subtle. A successful harvest, a shared meal, a song remembered correctly. Laughter was brief and practical. It did not interrupt life. It fit into it. In the end, medieval Scotland was not defined by singular suffering, but by accumulation. Cold layered on cold. Effort followed effort. Days were endured rather than celebrated. Life moved forward not through ambition, but through repetition. People did not ask whether life was brutal. They asked whether it continued. And most days, it did. That continuation shaped expectations. People planned only as far ahead as necessary. Long-term thinking existed, but it was cautious and practical. A field rotation, a roof repair postponed until spring, a child apprenticed when they were strong enough to be useful. Hope was present, but it was quiet and specific, never abstract. Money played a limited role for many. Barter and obligation mattered more. Debts were remembered personally, not recorded formally. Reputation carried weight. Being known as reliable was often more valuable than being skilled. Trust was slow to build and difficult to replace. Homes aged along with their occupants. Roofs sagged. Floors wore smooth. Smoke darkened beams year after year. Repairs were incremental. Nothing was replaced unless it failed completely. A house was never finished. It was simply maintained enough to remain standing. Food variety depended on location and fortune. Coastal areas fared better at times, relying on fish when crops struggled. Inland communities depended heavily on grain and whatever could be preserved. Preservation was constant work. Salting, drying, smoking. These methods extended survival, not enjoyment. Winter compressed life inward. Movement slowed. Days shortened. Conversations grew longer because there was little else to do. Tools were repaired. Stories were repeated. Silence filled the spaces between tasks. Cold was tolerated rather than resisted. Health declined without drama. Teeth failed. Vision dimmed. Pain became familiar enough to ignore. There were no expectations of comfort in old age. Survival itself was the measure of success. When someone could no longer work, they were supported if possible. Families absorbed the burden. Communities adjusted. There were limits, but abandonment was rare because everyone understood they would eventually need the same patience. Change arrived slowly. Innovations spread cautiously. New tools, new crops, new practices were adopted only after proof. Risk was expensive. Stability mattered more than improvement. Authority remained distant, but influential. Taxes were collected. Rules were enforced unevenly. Most people complied not out of loyalty, but because resistance was costly and rarely effective. Life cycles repeated predictably: birth, labor, illness, death. Each event acknowledged, then folded back into routine. Grief was real but restrained. Public mourning was brief. Private remembrance lingered quietly. There were no clear endings to most lives, just a gradual absence. A place at the hearth left empty, a tool unused, work redistributed without ceremony. Medieval Scotland did not rush, it endured. Comfort was rare, ease was temporary, but life persisted through habit and restraint. For those living it, there was no sense of missing out. There was only the present moment and the task at hand, and that, for most, was enough to fill a lifetime. By the later years of a life, memory carried more weight than anticipation. People remembered seasons more clearly than dates. A winter when the river froze solid, a summer when grain finally grew tall. These memories were practical, used to judge what might come next, even though the future rarely behaved as expected. Tools outlived people. A well-made knife, a worn plow, a wooden bowl smoothed by decades of use. Objects were passed down without sentimentality. They were valued because they worked, not because they belonged to someone before. Inheritance was functional. Illness returned often. Coughs lingered through winters. Joints swelled in damp weather. Pain was managed through habit rather than cure. Complaints were brief. Endurance was admired, but never praised openly. Community bonds were steady but restrained. People helped because they had to, not because it was noble. Mutual dependence was understood early and accepted without discussion. Conflicts happened, but long grudges were impractical. Life was too close, too intertwined. When death came, it rarely surprised. It was prepared for quietly. Words were said. Bodies were handled by those who knew them best. Rituals were followed because they gave structure, not because they erased loss. Afterward, life resumed. Fields were worked, meals were cooked, children filled gaps without understanding what had changed. The rhythm continued because it always had. Medieval Scotland did not offer comfort, choice, or escape. It offered continuity. For most people, that continuity was neither cruel nor kind. It was simply the shape of life. And in that shape, people lived, worked, aged, and disappeared, slowly, quietly, and without needing an ending worth remembering. That quiet disappearance was expected. Lives were not framed as stories with arcs. They were sequences of effort. When someone was gone, their absence settled into routine, like another change in weather, mentioned briefly. Adjusted for, then absorbed, time kept moving without ceremony. Seasons returned whether people were ready or not. Spring demanded planting even after loss. Autumn required harvest regardless of fatigue. There was little space for pause. Survival did not allow it. The landscape shaped temperament. Hills, wind, and water set limits that could not be argued with. People learned where not to build, where animals refused to graze, where paths washed away each year. Knowledge accumulated slowly, passed along without explanation. You learned because you had to. Ambition existed, but it was narrow. A slightly larger plot, a sturdier roof, enough surplus to survive winter without worry. No one expected more. Expectation itself was dangerous. Disappointment cost energy. Social order remained visible and mostly accepted. Rank was known by clothing, speech, and confidence. Deference was automatic, not debated. Those at the bottom rarely questioned it because alternatives were unclear. Stability, even unfair stability, felt safer than change. Occasionally, outside forces disrupted life. A new tax, a visiting authority, a call to provide labor or men. These demands were met with quiet compliance or careful avoidance. Resistance happened rarely and ended poorly. Despite hardship, people developed rhythms that worked. Work was paced. Rest happened when possible. Laughter surfaced briefly, then faded. Contentment was understated, but real. It appeared in moments when nothing went wrong. Evenings remained subdued. The fire burned low. Conversation slowed. The day ended without reflection. Tomorrow would require the same effort, so energy was conserved. Life in medieval Scotland was not lived in comparison to other times or places. There was no sense of being behind or deprived. There was only what existed: cold, work, community, continuation. History later labeled it brutal. Those living through it simply called it life. And then, without warning or drama, another day began. Morning arrived quietly, as it always did. Light crept in through small openings, revealing the same walls, the same tools, the same work, waiting without impatience. There was no sense of a fresh start. It was simply a return. People rose because there was something to do. Animals needed tending. Fires needed rebuilding. Water needed carrying. These tasks did not change, and that reliability offered a strange form of comfort. Predictability reduced thought. Thought conserved energy. Meals continued to be functional. Eating was brief and unceremonious. Food was fuel, not an experience. Conversation, if it happened, stayed close to immediate concerns. Weather, crops, repairs. Silence filled the rest. Over decades, lives blended together. Individual distinctions mattered less than roles. Someone was known as a farmer, a mason, a widow, a child. Identity was practical. Personal expression was limited by necessity, not rule. Even celebrations followed restraint. Weddings were modest. Feasts happened when resources allowed. Music played, then stopped. Joy existed but never lingered long enough to disrupt routine. Excess was risky. There was no expectation that life should be fair, comfortable, or interesting. These ideas had not yet formed. Survival framed everything. Any day without loss was considered acceptable. As generations passed, nothing felt historic. Buildings aged, paths shifted, stories changed slightly with each telling. Life continued without awareness of being observed, remembered, or recorded. Medieval Scotland did not know it would become an example. It did not know it would be summarized, analyzed, or described as brutal. It simply persisted, one unremarkable day at a time. And so the work resumed, quietly, without complaint, without conclusion. Another day lived, another night endured. Enough, again, for now. Eventually, even endurance faded without announcement. People slowed, then stopped, not because a chapter ended, but because the body no longer kept pace with routine. There was no clear moment when life changed meaningfully. Only small adjustments, sitting more, speaking less, watching others take over tasks that had once been automatic. Memory outlasted strength. Older people remembered how things used to be done and corrected mistakes quietly, often ignored. Advice was offered once. Repeated advice was unnecessary. Everyone learned in their own time, usually through error. The household absorbed change without comment. Tools moved to new hands. Sleeping arrangements shifted. Space was redistributed. Life reorganized itself efficiently, without sentiment. When someone died, it was noted, prepared for, and managed. The body was washed. The ground was opened. Words were said that had been said many times before. Grief existed, but it was contained. Excess emotion disrupted work, and work could not wait. Afterward, routine returned quickly. Not out of indifference, but necessity. The living still needed food, warmth, and shelter. The dead no longer did. In medieval Scotland, meaning was not searched for. It was assumed to exist somewhere beyond daily effort and not examined closely. Faith held what explanation could not. Habit carried the rest. Life did not improve dramatically. It did not collapse entirely either. It remained steady enough to continue, uneven enough to demand attention. That balance defined existence. History would later describe it as brutal, harsh, unforgiving. Those words belonged to distance. From within, life felt simply dense, heavy with tasks, narrow in options, manageable if approached one day at a time. There were no lessons drawn, no conclusions reached. Life was not something to understand. It was something to get through. And so medieval Scotland passed, not with noise or clarity, but with persistence, quiet, repetitive, and sufficient. The fire burned low. The light faded. Another ordinary life ended without needing to be remembered. And somewhere nearby, another began, already busy, surviving. That beginning looked exactly like the day before. A child learning to carry water without spilling. Someone older correcting a knot in a rope. A fire coaxed back to life with practiced movements. Nothing new, but everything necessary. Life offered very little variation. That sameness dulled fear. When days resemble each other closely enough, uncertainty becomes familiar. Familiar things are easier to tolerate. People did not imagine different lives. Imagination was practical. It stayed within reach. Better weather, a healthy animal, enough grain to last. Anything beyond that felt distant and unnecessary. Pain was not avoided. It was integrated. Sore joints, old injuries, constant fatigue. These were not obstacles. They were conditions. Work adjusted around them without discussion. Speech remained economical. Words were used when needed. Silence carried no tension. It was simply the absence of sound. Shared silence was common and comfortable. The land continued to dictate terms. Fields demanded attention. Weather ignored effort. People adapted because there was no alternative. Complaints changed nothing. Observation mattered more. Faith remained steady, not always passionate, but constant. It explained what could not be fixed. It organized time. It offered reassurance without solving problems. That was enough. Generations overlapped briefly. Knowledge passed imperfectly. Some skills were lost. Others persisted. Change happened slowly enough to feel accidental. No one thought of themselves as enduring brutality. They thought of themselves as living correctly, doing what was required, accepting what was given. And so, medieval Scotland continued, not because it was kind, but because it was consistent. Consistency allowed life to proceed. Another day folded into the next, quietly, without distinction. Enough, once more, to keep going. That quiet consistency carried everything forward. People trusted routine more than hope. Routine had proven reliable. Hope was optional. Work filled most waking hours, but it was rarely rushed. Speed wasted energy. Movements were learned slowly, repeated thousands of times, and eventually required very little thought. The body remembered what the mind no longer needed to consider. Mistakes happened, but they were absorbed into the day. A tool slipped, a pot cracked, a fence leaned a little more than it should. Most problems were not solved immediately. They were lived with until they demanded attention. The weather remained indifferent. Rain arrived when it pleased. Wind followed its own paths. People adjusted clothing, posture, and expectations accordingly. Control was not assumed. Adaptation was. Meals remained modest. Hunger was managed rather than eliminated. Satisfaction came from adequacy, not abundance. Finishing a meal without worry mattered more than enjoying it. Social ties were steady and unremarkable. Neighbors knew one another well enough to cooperate and little enough to avoid complication. Familiarity did not require intimacy. It required reliability. Festivals arrived occasionally and passed quickly. They offered interruption, not escape. Afterward, life returned to its usual shape, unchanged but briefly remembered. The passage of time was felt physically, in calloused hands, in worn joints, in tools smoothed by use. Age was visible, but it did not alter expectation. Everyone moved toward the same outcome at a pace set by circumstance. Medieval Scotland did not promise fulfillment. It promised continuity. That promise was usually kept. And so, life continued, quietly, with no need for explanation, drifting forward on habit alone. That drift required little reflection. Reflection had no clear purpose. It did not warm rooms, mend roofs, or bring rain at the right time. Attention stayed on what could be done with the hands. People learned to notice small efficiencies, a better grip on a tool, a path that stayed drier after rain, a way to stack firewood that slowed rot. These improvements mattered more than ideas. They saved effort, and effort was finite. Seasons continued their cycle with limited variation. Spring arrived reluctantly. Summer offered brief generosity. Autumn demanded preparation. Winter tested whatever had been done correctly or poorly. Each year felt familiar enough to predict, uncertain enough to require care. Homes remained modest. Space was organized around function. Everything had a place because clutter slowed movement and wasted time. Objects that no longer worked were repaired, repurposed, or quietly abandoned. Nothing decorative stayed long without becoming useful. Sleep came easily. Exhaustion ensured it. Nights were dark and uninterrupted. Without noise or light, rest arrived quickly and left slowly. Dreams were unimportant unless they lingered into morning, which they rarely did. Conversation remained practical. News spread gradually. Important information was repeated. Unimportant details faded. Memory favored what helped survive. Everything else dissolved. Children grew into adults without ceremony. One day they were capable. From then on, expectations changed. Responsibility arrived quietly and stayed. There was no clear boundary between hardship and normalcy. Cold was not considered harsh. Hunger was not considered extreme. These conditions were part of the environment, like hills or wind. They were navigated, not judged. Occasionally, someone left. A journey, an apprenticeship, military service. Departure was acknowledged without sentimentality. Return was uncertain. Life continued regardless. Medieval Scotland did not ask for admiration. It did not seek understanding. It existed in a narrow space between effort and rest, repeated until it could not be. History later supplied labels: brutal, harsh, unforgiving. Those words belonged to distance and comparison. Within the moment, life felt only full. Full of tasks, full of obligation, full enough to occupy every day until it ended. And when it did end, there was no sense of conclusion, only a quiet shift, one less presence. One more space adjusted. The fire burned as it always had. The work resumed. Another ordinary day unfolded, unchanged by how it might one day be described. That ordinariness was its defining feature. Nothing needed to stand out. Standing out invited attention, and attention rarely helped. Blending into routine was safer. People measured success narrowly. Enough food stored, roof still holding, no illness spreading through the household. These were quiet victories, acknowledged internally and then set aside. Satisfaction did not linger. Tools continued to shape posture and movement. Hands curved around familiar handles, muscles adapted to repeated strain. Bodies aged into their work, shaped by it gradually and permanently. There was no separation between labor and life. They were the same thing. Weather marked time more clearly than memory. A harsh winter was remembered long after names were forgotten. A gentle summer became a reference point, used cautiously, because expecting it again felt risky. Experience taught restraint. Care for the vulnerable existed, but within limits. Children were protected because they represented future labor. Elders were supported because they held knowledge, and because one day everyone hoped to receive the same patience. Compassion was practical. Authority remained distant, but unavoidable. Decisions arrived from elsewhere and were absorbed locally. Complaints were quiet. Compliance was strategic. Survival favored flexibility over defiance. Even faith settled into habit. Prayers repeated. Rituals observed. Comfort came not from answers, but from familiarity. Repetition steadied uncertainty. There was no sense of progress moving forward. Time felt circular rather than linear. The same tasks returned. The same concerns resurfaced. Life did not advance. It revolved. Medieval Scotland was not a place of constant suffering. It was a place of constant management. Managing cold, managing hunger, managing effort, managing expectations. That management filled entire lives. It left little room for anything else. And so days continued, not marked, not celebrated, simply completed, quietly, consistently. Enough, again, to carry life forward for one more day. Eventually, even management loosened its grip. People learned when effort no longer produced results and adjusted expectations downward without resentment. A field yielded less. A body tired sooner. A household shrank. These changes were accepted because resisting them achieved nothing. The idea of improvement existed only in fragments. A slightly warmer cloak. A roof that leaked less than last year. Progress was measured in reductions of discomfort, not in advancement. Anything that made life marginally easier was adopted and then folded into routine until it no longer felt new. Memory softened edges. Hard years blurred together. What remained were impressions rather than details. Cold, work, waiting. Stories lost their beginnings and endings, becoming instructions more than narratives. Do not plant there. Do not travel that way in winter. Do not expect help quickly. Community remained close but reserved. People knew each other's habits well enough to predict behavior. Trust was not emotional. It was practical. You trusted someone because they had always done what was required before. Conflict rarely escalated. Escalation wasted resources. Disagreements were contained, postponed, or ignored. Harmony was less important than stability. Stability kept everyone alive. As time passed, fewer things surprised anyone. Storms arrived, illness followed, death visited. Each event fit into an existing pattern. Shock was brief, adjustment followed. Children absorbed this calm acceptance early. They learned not through instruction, but exposure. By watching adults react to hardship without drama, they learned what was expected of them later. Endurance was not taught, it was modeled. Life continued to narrow as people aged. Tasks reduced, movement slowed, attention shifted outward rather than forward. Watching replaced planning, presence replaced ambition. When the end came, it was rarely described as tragic. It was described as expected. People had seen it many times before. They knew what followed and what was required of them next. Medieval Scotland did not create legends out of ordinary lives. It allowed them to pass without record. That anonymity was normal. Being remembered was not an expectation. What remained were patterns. Stone walls still standing, fields still worked, paths still followed, life leaving marks on land more than on pages. And so the days continued to pass, one into the next, steady enough to sustain existence, demanding enough to prevent reflection. Not dramatic, not merciful, simply ongoing. Another day finished, another night arrived, and somewhere, quietly, life carried on once more. That carrying on required no motivation. Motivation implies choice. Most days offered none. Tasks waited whether one felt prepared or not, and so they were done. People learned to pace themselves over decades rather than days. Energy was spent carefully. Nothing was pushed unless necessary. Rushing led to mistakes, and mistakes cost more effort than patience ever did. Weather signs were read automatically. A shift in wind, a smell of rain, frost forming earlier than expected. These details mattered more than dates or plans. They guided decisions quietly, without discussion. The body adapted in ways the mind barely noticed. Calluses thickened, sensitivity dulled, discomfort became background noise. When pain faded temporarily, it was noted only in hindsight. Households remained functional units rather than emotional ones. Cooperation mattered more than harmony. Arguments happened, but they ended quickly. Holding resentment required energy better spent elsewhere. Children learned limits early. What could be asked for? What could not? Wants narrowed naturally to match availability. Disappointment did not linger because expectation was low. Illness returned predictably with cold and damp. Some survived, some did not. Outcomes were accepted without explanation. There was no illusion of control to be shattered. Religion continued to offer structure rather than rescue. It marked time. It framed loss. It reassured without changing outcomes. That consistency was valued. Even dreams of something different remained faint. Stories of distant places existed, but they were treated as curiosities rather than possibilities. Curiosity did not translate into movement. Movement was expensive. Life remained bounded by what could be reached on foot, remembered by hand, repaired with familiar tools. Anything beyond that boundary was abstract and unnecessary. Medieval Scotland did not feel like a struggle against life. It felt like cooperation with its limits. People learned what could be managed and stopped demanding more. And so the pattern held. Work, rest, adjustment, repetition. No climactic moments, no resolution, just continuation, steady enough to fill years. Another day quietly complete. That completion did not bring satisfaction. It brought readiness. Readiness for the next repetition. Life trained people to finish one task only so another could begin. Nothing was optimized for pleasure. Tools were shaped for durability, clothing for warmth, homes for survival. Anything that added comfort without purpose was eventually removed or repurposed. Excess invited loss. People learned to accept partial success. A harvest that was enough, but not generous. A winter that was survivable, but uncomfortable. Enough became the standard. More was rare and treated cautiously. The passage of time was felt most clearly in absences. Someone no longer sitting by the fire. A voice no longer heard during work. These gaps were noticed briefly, then worked around. Life did not pause long enough to dwell. Knowledge accumulated quietly. What soil held moisture? Which animals survived cold best? How long grain could last if stored correctly? This knowledge was not written down. It lived in habit and correction. There were no expectations of rescue. If something failed, people adjusted downward. If help arrived, it was appreciated but not relied upon. Dependence was risky. Self-sufficiency was safer, even when limited. Social roles rarely changed. A person born into labor remained in it. Advancement was uncommon and fragile. Stability mattered more than movement. The idea of personal fulfillment did not exist. Fulfillment was collective and implicit. If the household endured, the individual had succeeded. Anything beyond that was unnecessary. Life ended the way it had been lived, quietly, without explanation, without summary. Just a gradual stopping. Medieval Scotland did not dramatize existence. It sustained it, through repetition, through restraint, through acceptance. And so the cycle continued, uninterrupted by the idea that it might one day be called history. Another task completed, another day settled into memory, and somewhere, just before dawn, life prepared to begin again. The beginning of the next day was as unremarkable as the last. Light crept through narrow windows, illuminating the same stone walls, the same worn tools, and the same tasks awaiting attention. Nothing called for excitement. Nothing demanded innovation. Life proceeded, as it always had. People moved with automatic precision. Hands knew their routines before the mind considered them. A fire was stoked. Water was carried. Animals were fed. Crops checked. Each motion was functional, practiced, and repeated. No one thought to question whether it mattered beyond the moment, it only mattered enough to survive. Food was prepared plainly. Breakfast, if it could be called that, was eaten quickly. Porridge, sometimes thin, sometimes thick, fueled the body but did little else. Conversation, when it occurred, centered only on immediate concerns: weather, work, repairs, anything outside that was irrelevant and quickly forgotten. Silence persisted around tasks. It was not oppressive, it was simply the absence of unnecessary noise. The rhythm of daily life moved steadily, unbroken, punctuated only by the occasional clatter of tools or the low murmur of human voices. Children followed adults, learning by observation, their expectations shaped by necessity rather than instruction. They understood early that survival required constant attention and measured effort. Play existed, but it was brief and functional, often entwined with work. Time felt cyclical. Seasons dictated action. Work rose and fell with light and weather. Nothing was rushed. Nothing lingered. The passage of years was felt in hands and backs, in the slow stiffening of joints, in the deepening knowledge of when and how to act. Illness, injury, and death were familiar companions. They arrived quietly, and when they left, life adjusted without ceremony. Routine absorbed gaps, redistributing labor and attention to ensure continuity. Faith and ritual provided structure without promise. Bells marked the day. Prayers punctuated moments of uncertainty. Familiar rituals grounded people, giving rhythm to an existence otherwise dominated by repetition and endurance. Medieval Scotland did not reward heroism. It did not acknowledge suffering. It demanded consistency, measured by the ability to persist through cold, fatigue, and scarcity. Success was simply living to see another day, and doing so without catastrophe. And so, as light continued to climb slowly over stone walls and muddy paths, people rose again, attended to their work, and moved quietly through the same patterns that had defined life for generations. Another day began. Another day would end, and through it all, life endured. Evening returned with the same quiet inevitability. Light faded slowly through small windows, leaving stone walls in shadow. Fires burned low, coaxed carefully from smoldering embers. Smoke drifted lazily, filling the room with familiar scents of warmth, cooked grain, and soot. People paused in their tasks not for rest, but because darkness demanded it. Hands that had worked steadily all day now performed only what was necessary to maintain the household: feeding animals, stoking fires, checking that tools were in place. Conversation dwindled to murmurs, often about what the next day might require, and then silence settled again. Meals were modest, eaten quickly, and more out of habit than enjoyment. A few scraps of meat if fortune allowed, bread or porridge otherwise. Eating was functional. Appetite was a practical concern, not pleasure. Children were guided to bed early, often sharing narrow, straw-filled spaces with siblings and adults. Warmth, not privacy, dictated sleeping arrangements. They drifted into sleep soothed by routine, the sound of fire and the low breathing of others marking the night. Adults lingered near the hearth, checking embers, repairing clothing, or mending tools. Even leisure was purposeful: a song, a story, or a brief laugh, all brief and carefully measured so that no energy was wasted. Pain and fatigue were constant companions, yet largely ignored. Joints ached, backs stiffened, illness lingered without attention beyond basic care. Survival required endurance, not complaint. The cold night pressed in, but it was familiar. Blankets and shared body heat offered mitigation. Darkness was not threatening. It was simply the space between efforts, a pause in the rhythm of doing. Time passed unnoticed, marked only by the dimming fire, the occasional sigh, the rustle of straw, and the distant sounds of the landscape outside. The world continued beyond these walls, largely irrelevant unless it directly affected survival. Medieval Scotland existed in repetition, without fanfare, without expectation. Days ended as they began, quietly, steadily, inevitably. Life's measure was continuity, not comfort or recognition. And so, another night closed, another day had passed, and somewhere, quietly, existence prepared to begin again. Morning returned slowly, gray and damp, as it always did. The stone walls had cooled overnight, and the hearth required patient coaxing back to life. Smoke curled into the low ceiling, reminding everyone that warmth, like water and food, had to be earned each day. People rose not with excitement, but with necessity. Hands already remembered the motions, tending animals, fetching water, checking that fires would burn long enough to last the morning. Every movement was deliberate, shaped by years of repetition, conserving energy while accomplishing only what was essential. Breakfast was brief and plain. Porridge, sometimes thick, sometimes watery, filled the stomach, but offered little joy. Conversation centered on tasks at hand, whether the fields would hold moisture, whether the roof had survived the night's wind, whether livestock were accounted for. Anything beyond that was extraneous and easily forgotten. Children followed closely, learning by observation rather than instruction. They understood quickly which actions mattered and which could be ignored. Play existed in small doses, often disguised as work or errands. By the time adolescence arrived, they were already fully absorbed in daily labor. Time passed unremarkably. Seasons dictated every action. Work began with light and ended with darkness. Life advanced slowly, almost imperceptibly, measured by the wear of tools and the fading strength of the body. Pain, fatigue, and minor illness were constant companions, integrated into the rhythm of life, rather than treated as interruptions. Evenings arrived quietly, fires were tended carefully, meals were modest, and sleep came early. Adults repaired tools, mended clothing, or simply watched embers fade, conserving energy for the day ahead. Silence was normal, not uncomfortable. Faith and ritual structured life, without promising relief. Bells marked time. Prayers offered rhythm and reassurance. Survival did not depend on belief, but belief shaped the acceptance of what could not be controlled. Medieval Scotland offered no heroism, no drama, no comfort beyond what could be manufactured or borrowed from routine. Life was measured in continuity, in endurance, in the quiet fulfillment of the necessary. Success was defined by seeing another day, not by happiness, triumph, or recognition. And so, once again, the cycle began anew. Hands moved, fires burned, work was done, and life endured quietly, steadily, without expectation, without reward, without end. By midday, the day had settled into its usual rhythm. Tasks were completed in silence or quiet murmurs. The rhythm of work feeding animals, tending fields, repairing tools, checking stores dominated time. Each motion was economical, honed by repetition over years. There was no hurry, only necessity. The sun climbed slowly, bringing little change. Heat was mild, insufficient to alter the day's pace. Shadows shifted across stone walls and earthen floors, marking hours that were otherwise unremarkable. Work continued according to what could be accomplished within light, rather than any desire for progress. Meals were functional. Bread, porridge, sometimes a piece of salted meat. Flavor mattered little. Hunger and energy dictated eating, not enjoyment. Water came from nearby sources, cold and sometimes uncertain in quality, yet accepted without complaint. Children moved alongside adults, imitating gestures, observing habits, internalizing routines. They understood early that effort ensured survival and that deviation was costly. Play existed but was brief, embedded in work, or disguised as practice. Lessons were subtle, absorbed through observation rather than instruction. Bodies aged quietly, backs stiffened, joints ached, hands were worn. Weakness was managed pragmatically, with work adjusted or paused briefly. Fatigue was habitual. It did not demand attention. It simply existed. Evenings approached without ceremony. Fires were tended, meals prepared, and eaten quickly, tools stored or repaired. Conversation dwindled. Silence returned, comfortable and accepted. Nights offered rest, not reflection. Sleep arrived from exhaustion rather than peace. Faith remained steady, routine, reliable. Bells, prayers, and small rituals marked time and offered reassurance. They explained little, but they steadied hearts and minds accustomed to endurance. Medieval Scotland did not offer comfort, innovation, or reward. It offered repetition, habit, and persistence. Survival was its own achievement, continuity, its own measure of success. And, as daylight faded once more, life prepared to begin again in the same quiet, unremarkable way it always had. Another day completed, another night endured, and, as ever, life persisted. Night settled slowly over medieval Scotland, as it always did. Darkness pressed in through narrow windows, bringing quiet and cold, softened only by the low glow of carefully tended fires. Smoke curled upward, carrying the faint scent of cooking and warmth, filling the room with familiar comfort. People moved carefully, performing only what was necessary. Fires were stoked, animals were checked, tools were set in order for the morning. Conversation had all but disappeared, leaving only the low hum of life in motion, measured and deliberate. Silence was natural, neither oppressive nor empty. Meals were modest and quickly eaten. Porridge, sometimes thin, sometimes thick, provided fuel. Anything else was a luxury rarely afforded. Appetite was practical, survival-driven, not pleasure-based. Children were guided to narrow, shared straw beds. Warmth dictated sleeping arrangements more than privacy. They drifted into sleep surrounded by the breathing of others, soothed by the familiar rhythms of the household. Adults lingered near the hearth, mending tools or clothing, repairing what could be repaired. Even leisure was purposeful. A brief story, a short song, a soft laugh, measured so that energy was preserved. Pain and fatigue were constant companions, but ignored unless they prevented necessary work. Cold pressed in steadily, but it was familiar. Blankets and shared body heat mitigated its sting. Night was not threatening. It was simply a pause in the steady rhythm of effort, a space to rest and endure. Time passed largely unmarked. The fading fire, the occasional cough, the shuffle of straw were all signals of progression. Life continued largely independent of human attention, unaffected by expectation. Medieval Scotland offered no heroism, no spectacle, no comfort beyond what routine could provide. Life was measured in continuity, in endurance, in quiet persistence. Survival itself was the standard of success. And so, as the night deepened, another day concluded. Fires burned low, tasks paused, sleep came, and somewhere nearby, life prepared, quietly and steadily, to begin again.